The last agent of change and evolution is natural selection. So we talked a little bit about this already with Darwin, but now we're going to talk about it in a little more detail. Basically, what you need as far as how to get to natural selection occurring. So let's take a look. There are 3 conditions that need to be satisfied in order for evolution by natural selection to occur. So first condition, this one's pretty easy for us to think about, and that is you need variation in a trait. So there has to be variation in the characteristics for an organism. So whether that is, like you can see here, skin color, hair color, eye color, height. As far as gender goes, that is actually not considered a characteristic for variation, because most organisms, they do have gender for reproduction. So you need to have some sort of variation in the characteristics in order for natural selection to be able to occur. The second one is heritability. So the characteristics must be able to be passed from parent to offspring. So the characteristic has to have the information, directions coded for in the DNA, right? So you need to be able to pass that down from parent to offspring. The last one is what we call differential reproductive success. Okay? And this sounds like it's super complicated, but it really isn't. This actually goes back to Malthus's idea. Right? So differential reproductive success is this. There are more organisms born than can survive, and organisms are continually struggling for existence, meaning that organisms are constantly looking for food, water, shelter. Right? And because of 1 and 2, some organisms are more likely than others to survive and reproduce. Right? And so that's what we mean by differential reproductive success, that you're going to have this kind of fight for food and shelter and water in order to be able to survive and reproduce. And the differential part is some of them will be better at doing that than others. All right. Will they die out because they can't, get food and water? That is a possibility, but generally what happens is they just don't reproduce as much. Okay? So those are the 3 conditions. So I've got it in some different pictures here. So we've got variation for a trait, so different genes, different variations of the gene. You can see they're all on the same spot. Heritability, that gene can be passed from parent to offspring, and the same would be true for any of these colors. And then here's the differential reproductive success. Like I said, they can all reproduce, but they're going to do it at different amounts. So in this case, the one with the blue version of the gene is going to be much better at surviving and reproducing than the ones with, say, the teal, the yellow, or the purple. So those are the 3 conditions. If one of these is missing, you cannot have natural selection. All right? Another way to put this is, if you would like to think about it as bunnies, right? Bunnies run at different speeds. That ability to run is going to be passed on. And differential reproductive success in this instance is, are you going to get eaten or not? Right? So, okay. So then the question is, why do these organisms survive? How is this working? So we've got a peacock and a peahen, and then we've got these deer down here fighting. right? And the fighting isn't the question here, it's the antlers, right? So what is going on here? So what's going on up here with the peacock? What are these deer fighting about? Now, the peacock, some of you may have said and may be familiar with the fact that this is the male. And this male is showing off for the peahen, who in this instance does not look very impressed. So he is displaying for reproduction. And these deer down here are fighting with each other to basically determine who is the bigger, badder deer. Again, for reproduction, who gets to be in charge of that area to look for females. And we see this over and over again, these strange structures that shouldn't exist. And so think about this tail. This tail shouldn't exist because this should affect the ability to survive and reproduce. This tail can be almost as much in weight as the bird itself. It's big, it's long, it's bright and showy colored. This should get you killed, but they don't get rid of the tail, and that's because the tail is used for reproduction. Same thing with these antlers. These antlers take a lot of time and energy to grow. They grow them every year. They're made out of bone, so it takes a lot of material to do. And then this fighting is dangerous. There are lots of instances where we find the skulls of these guys locked together. They've died because they lock their horns together and can't get unlocked. Plus you can get caught on things and, you know, get tangled. So why does this work? Because it still works towards the reproduction part. And it actually is tied to the survival part, because if you can survive with this giant tail, that means that you're good at surviving, therefore you should be getting your genes passed on. All right, so tied to the whole natural selection section, most of our agricultural pests, things like beetles and caterpillars and so forth, evolve resistance to our pesticides, our chemicals that we use to kill them. So my question is, how does this happen? So what is it that happens that allows them to evolve that resistance? My guess is that you probably described something along the lines of, our pesticides don't kill all the pests, and so the pests that are left behind are going to reproduce, and their offspring won't be killed by the pesticides, or at least not as well, and that's exactly it. So every time we grab a pen here, so let's say we have some beetles. I know, they're great, right? Okay, so we've got these 5 beetles, and the first time we spray the pesticides, we are going to kill that one, and that one, and that one, right? But these 2 survive and reproduce. Well, these guys didn't die because they have something to help protect them from the pesticides in some way. And they likely will pass that on to their offspring. And so all of their offspring will have that protection as well. And so unless we change the pesticide, increase the pesticide, spray this pesticide longer, those guys are going to continue to evolve and pass that information on. All right, if you're following along with the textbook, we are not going to look at Hardy-Weinberg. We're going to skip right on to adaptations. So with natural selection, this is one way that organisms can become adapted to their environment. So for example, this polar bear is very well adapted to his environment. Think about if this polar bear was in Ohio. Wouldn't work so well, right? But up in the northern areas, for the most part, these guys work pretty well. Their coloring helps hide them. Their fur helps insulate them. They have big, thick pads on their feet to keep them from, getting their feet too cold or burnt. They have their carnivorous teeth and claws to be able to help them feed. They are well adapted to their environment. So this is tied to fitness, right? And this adaptation over time does affect fitness. So we talked before in another video about fitness. This is the reproduction of individuals. Now, we're looking at it a little differently. Reproduction of an individual with one characteristic compared to the reproductive output of individuals of the same species with alternative characteristics. So again, we're looking at how they're reproducing in the same species. So we can't, for example, compare fruit flies to humans because we don't reproduce the same way. But say we can compare one polar bear to another polar bear, right? But maybe one polar bear has a thicker coat than the other polar bear. So we're going to measure fitness. So let's go back to our fruit flies. So fruit fly A has genes for a version of the trait that allows it to survive for a long time without food, and fly B has a different version that allows it to survive only a short time without food. So which fly has the greater fitness? Most of the time my class says that fly A. But the thing is that you're missing information. I haven't told you anything about food. Does it matter if the food is there or not? Yeah, because if there's plenty of food around, does it matter which version of these traits the flies have? Doesn't matter, right? So that actually is another part of fitness. So there are 3 elements to an organism's fitness. Let me move my face again. All right, so the first part is what we've been talking about, right? We measure it relative to genetic or physical characteristics in the population. So we're going to compare them based on their characteristics. But the second part is need to look at the environment, because these organisms can adapt through natural selection to their environment. Now, some of them will adapt and stay adapted, like a polar bear, but other ones will adapt based on where they're at, right? And they'll adapt through natural selection. So, for example, these little pocket mice, aren't they cute? These little guys will actually change over time. Their population will, based on their habitat. So, for example, if they are found in this light-colored area, like a sandy area, you're going to get these light-colored mice. So you're not going to see very many of the genes, or you can see the alleles, the versions of the genes for dark-colored mice. So you won't see many of them. Versus if you find them on a dark background, so a rocky area, something like that, in the rocky habitats, you're going to find a lot more of the dark-colored furred mice, right? And so the fitness here is actually tied to their environment. And that makes a difference. We can't compare these guys without looking at their environment. It's not fair to compare the light-colored mice here and the light-colored mice here. They're not in the same environment. Same with the dark-colored mice. So we need to look at the environment as part of the fitness. Oh, and sorry, you probably noticed, but just to point out, the reason why you don't see the opposite color, so you don't see the light color mice here or the dark color mice here very often, is because you can see them, right? And so since they stand out, they get eaten. It's the same idea as if you've heard about like the albino squirrels and stuff. People get really upset when the albino squirrels get eaten, but there's a reason why there aren't many albino animals. And that's not just because the genes are rare, but also because they stand out and they get eaten out in the wild. And then the last part is the other part of it that we've talked about, which is the reproductive success part. So comparing the characteristics, their environment, and the reproductive success compared to other organisms in the population. So you have to take into account not just the characteristics and the reproductive success, but also what environment they're in. So it's not fair to, compare fitness of polar bears in the Arctic to if we move polar bears to, say, Columbus. Because that's not the same sort of environment that they are used to being adapted to.